Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. Amelia Cooper sat absolutely motionless inside the freezing cockpit of her stealth reconnaissance vessel. The absolute silence of deep space pressed heavily against the reinforced hull of her ship as she drifted silently past the desolate boundary of Pluto. She was a solitary pilot, a lone phantom executing a top-secret directive ordered directly by Earth Command. The coordinates programmed into her navigation console pointed straight toward the darkest, most uncharted edge of the solar system. Her vessel operated on strictly minimal power reserves, emitting absolutely no thermal signatures and reflecting zero light. She had become a ghost, slipping unnoticed through the terrifying expanse of the outer void. Just 3 weeks prior, Earth had descended into a state of sheer panic. Long-range probes had detected the arrival of a massive alien armada. This incomprehensible fleet materialized abruptly at the extreme outer limits of the solar system. Yet, to the profound bewilderment of the Planetary Defense Council, the armada did not advance. Instead of launching a swift invasion, the colossal alien warships meticulously arranged themselves into a tight, defensive blockade. They were not preparing to strike the inner planets. They were barricading a specific coordinate, and their rigid formation radiated an unmistakable sense of cosmic dread. Amelia had been chosen to find out why. Her sole mission was to bypass this formidable blockade, remain completely undetected, and uncover exactly what an alien armada of that magnitude could possibly be guarding. As her stealth vessel glided silently past the outermost perimeter of the enemy cruisers, she peered intently into the abyss lying straight ahead. A deeply unsettling realization washed over her. The alien ships were not facing Earth. Their bows were pointed outward, their unimaginably destructive weapons trained squarely on the empty void in front of them. They were guarding a pitch-black sector of space where absolutely no starlight seemed to penetrate. Without warning, the primary optical sensors and telemetry displays inside her cockpit began to glitch wildly. The screens flickered with violent bursts of static, throwing streams of red warning errors across the glass. Amelia fought to recalibrate the lenses, holding her breath, when the visual feeds finally stabilized and pierced through the artificial darkness. She gasped loudly in the empty cabin. "What in the universe happened here?" she whispered to herself, her voice trembling slightly in the quiet cabin. The pitch-black area was not empty space. It was a sprawling, horrific graveyard. Suspended dead in the freezing vacuum were thousands upon thousands of colossal alien shipwrecks. They drifted aimlessly, their violently shattered hulls forming a macabre orbit. This silent, floating tomb stretched out into the darkness for tens of thousands of miles in every direction. The sheer scale of the destruction was entirely incomprehensible. Mustering her courage, she pushed her stealth ship deeper into the dense debris field. She navigated carefully, maneuvering her fragile craft between the gargantuan, jagged chunks of twisted alien metal. Peering intently through the densely layered wrecks, her wide eyes locked onto the absolute center of the graveyard. Anchored securely in the very heart of the devastation was a structure that defied all human logic. It was a colossal, dark metal fortress. Its sheer size absurdly dwarfed even the largest ruined alien dreadnoughts floating helplessly around it. The surface of the impenetrable black metal was heavily scarred, deeply scorched, and bore the violent marks of thousands of years of brutal war. It stood like a silent monolith, a grim testament to an era of apocalyptic violence. As Amelia studied the tactical readouts bouncing back from the structure, a horrifying clarity settled over her racing mind. The alien armada stationed right outside the debris field was not blockading the solar system to threaten Earth at all. They were actively forming a desperate cage around this very graveyard. They possessed overwhelming firepower, yet not a single alien ship in that massive fleet dared to cross the invisible threshold of the floating wrecks. They were absolutely terrified. Whatever entity, weapon, or nightmare resided inside that violently scarred, dark fortress had been sleeping undisturbed for 15,000 years. Amelia finally understood that the entire alien fleet outside was totally paralyzed by the crippling terror that the ancient fortress might suddenly wake up. The risk was absolute, but the alternative was certain death. "Computer, initiate full system shutdown," Amelia commanded, her breath misting visibly in the rapidly dropping temperature of the tiny cabin. "Cut primary engines, disable active radar, and cycle life support down to barely 3%. The low, comforting hum of the stealth vessel died instantly, plunging her into a suffocating, terrifying quiet. She was entirely at the mercy of basic physics now, utilizing the last residual burst of forward momentum to let her fragile ship drift helplessly, unguided, deeper into the dark belly of the metallic tomb. By completely killing her energy signature and shutting down the heating coils, she became nothing more than another piece of freezing, floating junk. It was an agonizingly slow process, but it was the only way to render herself entirely invisible to the highly advanced, sweeping scanners of the terrified armada looming far behind her. As her powerless vessel floated deeper into the silent graveyard, the true, mind-bending horror of the cosmic battlefield began to reveal itself outside her reinforced glass window, gliding agonizingly close to the mangled debris. She realized, with mounting dread, that these shattered husks did not belong to a single enemy force. She drifted past jagged shards of deep purple crystalline cruisers, then past the hollowed-out bellies of organic, bone-like frigates, and further still past sleek, geometric dreadnoughts forged from unrecognizable dark alloys. There were remnants from dozens of vastly different galactic civilizations, all gathered in this desolate corner of space, and all violently exterminated over different eras. However, it was the specific nature of their destruction that made Amelia's blood run cold. They had not been melted by plasma arcs or incinerated by concentrated thermal lasers. Every single vessel had been brutally crushed, completely punctured, and ripped apart by an unimaginable force of sheer physical trauma. It was as if a cosmic hammer of unfathomable density had smashed through their heavily armored hulls with effortless, impossible cruelty. The deeper she drifted into the abyss, the larger the shadows became, until the monolithic structure at the very center entirely eclipsed the distant, faint starlight. The fortress was a nightmare of brutalist architecture and supreme military engineering, defying the natural laws of scale. As she floated within a few hundred miles of its outer shell, the staggering details finally came into sharp focus. Protruding from the heavily scarred, carbonized metal walls were tens of thousands of gargantuan gun turrets. They sat completely motionless, their enormous, pitch-black muzzles pointing blindly into the void, like rows of dormant metallic beasts. The towering, impenetrable walls of the colossal structure were intricately carved with a chaotic web of strange, sharply angled characters. Amelia cautiously initialized a purely passive optical scan, feeding the raw visual data into her ship's restricted linguistic matrix. The system rapidly ran through every known historical, terrestrial, and hypothetical linguistic database currently possessed by humanity. A bright red error message blinked softly on her dim console. The characters belonged to absolutely nothing on record. They were completely alien to human knowledge, glowing faintly under the thick, undisturbed layers of ancient cosmic dust. While Amelia floated, utterly captivated by the looming superstructure, a sudden erratic shift in the distant light caught her attention. Far out at the very edge of the graveyard, The strictly disciplined formation of the alien armada faltered for just a moment. One of the sleek, heavily armed scout ships, perhaps driven by an impatient commander or suffering from a malfunctioning navigation thruster, abruptly broke rank. The vessel surged forward, accelerating carelessly past the established blockade line and plunging recklessly toward the outermost layer of the floating debris. Amelia watched, with bated breath, her cold hands tightly gripping the armrests of her freezing chair. The rogue alien scout ship ventured barely 4 miles into the dead zone before it abruptly collided with something entirely unseen. There was no physical barrier made of metal or stone, but the primary front shields of the alien vessel flared violently as it scraped against the very edge of an invisible, highly energized magnetic boundary that tightly encapsulated the entire ancient fortress. The retaliation was instantaneous and absolutely merciless. In the span of a single heartbeat, one of the tens of thousands of dormant turrets on the fortress snapped aggressively into alignment. Without any warning sequence or energy-gathering glow, a blinding, razor-thin beam of freezing blue light shot directly across the darkness. Because they were surrounded by a total vacuum, there was no explosive sound, only a terrifying, silent flash of absolute annihilation. The beam did not just pierce the armor of the alien scout ship. It completely shredded the highly advanced vessel on a subatomic level. In less than a fraction of a second, the proud, deadly spacecraft was reduced to an expanding, silent cloud of microscopic, glowing ash. The reaction from the alien armada was immediate and steeped in unadulterated panic. The entire fleet, consisting of thousands upon thousands of colossal warships, scrambled their massive sublight engines simultaneously. They aggressively reversed their trajectories, violently shoving each other out of the way as they frantically retreated hundreds of thousands of miles back into the safety of deep space, utterly terrified of triggering a second lethal shot. Inside her freezing, slowly drifting ship, Amelia let out a long, shaky breath. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, echoing loudly in the silent cabin. The dark, heavily scarred fortress sitting in the center of the ruins was absolutely not a dead relic of a forgotten era. It was merely resting in a deep, enduring hibernation. The automated defense protocols running quietly within its heavily armored core had not degraded a single fraction over the millennia. They remained terrifyingly sharp, highly reactive, and flawlessly lethal. The fortress was a patient, immortal predator, resting quietly in the frozen shadows of the outer solar system, eternally waiting for the next foolish enemy to make a fatal mistake. And right now, without any engines or power to change course, Amelia was floating helplessly straight toward its heavily guarded, invisible threshold. The silent annihilation of the alien scout ship was not an isolated event confined solely to the unlucky vessel. The sheer magnitude of the subatomic disintegration instantly unleashed a violently invisible shockwave of displaced kinetic energy radiating outward through the frozen vacuum. Amelia's powerless stealth craft, caught entirely helpless in the expanding ripple, was violently hurled forward, like a dry leaf caught in a hurricane. She screamed aloud as the tiny cabin violently shook, throwing her aggressively against her safety harness. Her ship tumbled wildly out of control, crashing directly and brutally into the impenetrable black metal of the fortress's colossal outer hull. The sickening crunch of the buckling metal echoed through her seat. The brutal impact instantly shattered the primary navigational sensors, cracked the heavily reinforced windshield, and catastrophically severed the main life support conduits running through the bulkhead. A terrifyingly high-pitched shriek filled the freezing, darkened cabin as her precious, life-saving oxygen began violently hissing out into the unforgiving void of deep space. Red warning klaxons instantly blared to life, casting an eerie, bloody glow across the shattered glass. The digital readout on her wrist monitor rapidly plummeted, brutally informing her that she had less than 2 minutes of breathable air remaining before total asphyxiation. Raw panic viciously clawed at her throat. She desperately slammed her fists against the control console. But the manual override systems were completely dead. The auxiliary thrusters remained totally unresponsive, crippled by the sheer force of the collision. She was hopelessly pinned against the heavily scarred, unyielding armor of the ancient monolithic structure, bleeding profusely from a deep gash directly above her left eye, and rapidly suffocating in the dark. Driven by pure, unadulterated survival instinct, her shaking, blood-stained fingers flew across the shattered emergency communications panel. She forcefully bypassed the highly sophisticated, standard military encryption protocols of her era. Instead, she frantically engaged an archaic, completely unencrypted analog broadcast frequency. With her vision beginning to blur at the edges from the lack of oxygen, she tapped out a rudimentary distress beacon. She broadcasted a simple, desperate cry for help using a primitive Earth transmission code, an old, practically obsolete language protocol entirely forgotten by modern galactic fleets. It was a completely irrational, desperate act, tossing a fragile message in a bottle into an abyssal, silent ocean, hoping against all rational logic that something out there in the dark graveyard was actually listening to her. For several agonizing, drawn-out seconds, there was absolutely nothing but the frantic, terrifying hissing of escaping air and the deafening, rapid pounding of her own failing heart. Her lungs burned with an agonizing fire. Then, the colossal monolithic structure, directly beneath her severely damaged ship, began to physically vibrate. Deep within the thick, carbonized metal walls, a profound, heavy mechanical hum resonated, vibrating intensely through the very bones in her teeth. The dormant fortress abruptly and aggressively shifted its state. Tens of thousands of brilliant, pure white floodlights snapped on sequentially along the massive hull, completely blinding the pitch-black sector of space with their sudden, overwhelming intensity. Amelia fiercely braced herself, tightly closing her eyes and clenching her jaw, fully expecting a beam of freezing blue energy to instantly vaporize her shattered cabin just as it had destroyed the scout ship. However, the thousands of massive, dormant gun turrets remained perfectly, eerily still. Instead, an enormous section of the massive hull directly beneath her violently damaged ship began to smoothly retract. A colossal airlock door, easily large enough to comfortably swallow an entire modern heavy cruiser, slowly and silently ground open. Powerful, completely invisible tractor beams gently seized her tiny, suffocating vessel, arresting its chaotic spin, and smoothly pulled it safely into the blindingly bright, cavernous interior right before the incredibly heavy metal doors slammed firmly shut against the terrifying, lethal vacuum of space. The violent hissing inside her depressurized cabin abruptly ceased as the external environment changed. Amelia remained frozen in her pilot seat, her chest heaving violently as she gripped the armrests with white knuckles. The heavy exterior blast shields of her shattered cockpit automatically retracted as the external pressure flawlessly equalized. Her hands trembled as she tentatively reached up and unsealed the heavy locking mechanism of her pressurized helmet, fully expecting the highly toxic fumes of an unknown alien atmosphere to immediately burn her desperate lungs. Instead, she took a hesitant, shallow breath and instantly gasped in pure, unadulterated shock. The air flooding directly into her ruined ship was beautifully crisp, exceptionally clean, and smelled faintly of ozone and fresh rain. It was not a generic, roughly synthesized life-sustaining mixture. It was a highly complex atmosphere, meticulously and flawlessly calibrated to the exact biological and chemical requirements of human lungs. As she unbuckled her restrictive harness and carefully stepped out of the shattered canopy onto the expansive, immaculate metal deck of the massive landing bay, she felt the deeply familiar, incredibly comforting pull of Earth-normal gravity perfectly anchoring her boots to the floor. The ambient temperature was precisely regulated to a warm, comfortable 72 degrees. It was a profound, mind-bending impossibility. She was standing deep inside the belly of a 15,000-year-old alien war machine, isolated at the very edge of the solar system. Yet her physical senses screamed that she was exactly at home. She slowly walked across the immense, brightly lit hangar bay, the heavy thud of her combat boots echoing sharply against the pristine, polished floor. The towering, sweeping interior walls were constructed from the exact same dark, indestructible alloy as the exterior, but they were absolutely not dormant. The chaotic, incomprehensible web of strange and sharply angled characters that she had observed on the outside hull were now fiercely glowing with a soft, warmly pulsing golden light from within the metal itself. As Amelia stopped and stared closely at a massive, structural pillar, the glowing alien symbols suddenly began to violently shift and writhe. They smoothly detached from their original, rigid positions, sliding and rapidly reassembling across the smooth metal surface, like thousands of pieces of a complex, living, fluid puzzle. Right before her disbelieving, wide eyes, the incomprehensible geometric shapes swiftly rearranged themselves, actively smoothing out their harsh, sharp angles. The mysterious characters miraculously transformed, shifting rapidly through several distinct evolutionary stages of linguistics until they finally settled into an archaic, yet entirely undeniable, early form of human writing. She could clearly and easily read the ancient syntax. The sweeping walls were not displaying alien combat logs or foreign operational manuals. They were proudly and beautifully displaying the familiar names, the military ranks, and the deeply personal, desperate final testimonies of ancient human soldiers who had fought in a forgotten war. Before she could even begin to fully process the staggering, world-shattering gravity of this impossible revelation, the total heavy silence of the vast, glowing landing bay was gently broken. It was not the cold, synthetic blare of a military alarm or the robotic drone of a security protocol. The entire, colossal fortress resonated with a deeply melodic, profoundly warm, artificially generated voice. The incredibly soft sound seemed to emanate directly from the very walls themselves, completely enveloping Amelia in an overwhelming, physical embrace of pure, maternal tenderness. It was undeniably the exact cadence and emotional tone of a deeply loving mother, finally laying eyes on a precious child she truly believed was lost forever to the darkness. Identity firmly confirmed. The warm, rich voice echoed gracefully through the immense hall, carrying a profound, heavy emotional weight that brought sudden, completely unbidden tears stinging to Amelia's eyes. Genetic sequencing aligns perfectly with the primary ancient foundational records. Welcome back. The incredibly long, dark night is finally over. The last legitimate heir of the bloodline has safely returned to us. Guided by the pulsating golden path illuminated on the deck, Amelia ventured deeper into the heart of the ancient structure. The echoing silence of the vast corridors was profoundly heavy, completely saturated with the unseen ghosts of an unrecognizable past. The heavy blast doors of the Central Command Nexus parted smoothly as she approached, revealing a chamber of breathtaking, dizzying proportions. There were no physical consoles, no archaic buttons, and absolutely no flat digital screens. Instead, as she tentatively stepped onto the central raised dais, the entire room dissolved around her. The air itself ignited with densely packed, highly tangible particles of light. She was instantly submerged in a staggering, completely immersive three-dimensional holographic projection. It was not merely a visual record. It was a vividly captured memory, flooding her raw senses with the phantom heat of distant, exploding suns and the suffocating, bitter ash of burning worlds. Amelia stood utterly paralyzed as the true, heavily censored history of her species unfolded in violent, hyper-realistic detail. Her entire foundational understanding of the universe, everything she had been taught in the military academies of Earth, was violently ripped apart. Earth's historical archives consistently painted humanity as a young, fragile, and chronically terrified species, desperately looking up at the vast stars and praying to remain unnoticed by superior, highly evolved extraterrestrial predators. The blinding, deafening truth surrounding her now screamed the exact, horrifying opposite. Humanity was never the prey hiding in the dark. In the deeply buried epics of the distant past, human beings were the undisputed, apex nightmares of the Milky Way galaxy. The swirling holograms showcased colossal human dreadnoughts, millions of miles long, mercilessly eclipsing the skies of countless alien worlds. She witnessed her ancestors waging brutal campaigns of absolute extermination, driven by an insatiable, bloodthirsty appetite for conquest and supreme galactic domination. They were not curious explorers reaching out in peace. They were merciless butchers, harvesting entire solar systems and subjugating thousands of highly advanced alien civilizations under the crushing, iron heel of a unified Terran empire. The dizzying projections abruptly shifted, the vibrant colors bleeding from a triumphant, blinding gold into a sickly, violent crimson. The supreme human empire did not fall to an external alien threat. It greedily consumed itself. A catastrophic, apocalyptic civil war violently fractured the human race. It was a brutal ideological schism that literally ripped the fabric of the galaxy apart. As the agonizingly vivid scenes played out before her terrified, unblinking eyes, Amelia witnessed the terrifying scale of the internal conflict. Brother fought brother with catastrophic weapons that deliberately shattered planetary cores and unraveled the very fabric of local space-time. One specific faction, utterly exhausted by the endless slaughter and deeply horrified by the complete irreversible decay of their own biological empathy, finally recognized the catastrophic trajectory of their unchecked evolution. They realized with crushing clarity that their absolute technological supremacy had entirely eroded their human souls. In the war's final, devastating climax, this repentant faction was militarily defeated, but their surrender was a calculated, profoundly philosophical choice: to atone for the infinite oceans of blood permanently staining their hands, and to desperately salvage whatever fractured fragments of humanity remained. They made an agonizing, unthinkable sacrifice. They systematically and purposefully dismantled their godlike technology. They deliberately wiped their own collective memory banks, burning their grand digital libraries to ash. They willingly shackled themselves to the primitive mud of Earth, actively forcing their own descendants back into the unforgiving brutality of the Stone Age. It was a self-imposed purgatory, a desperate, generational gamble to learn basic humility through thousands of years of manual suffering, hoping against hope that one day their distant children might rebuild their civilization with a fully functioning conscience. The holographic narrative ruthlessly marched forward, plunging Amelia into an even deeper, colder nightmare. The victorious faction, completely devoid of remorse and deeply intoxicated by their absolute, tyrannical power, looked upon the self-exiled remnants on Earth with sheer, unadulterated disgust. To them, biological existence was a disgusting, inherent weakness that needed to be purged. The victors permanently abandoned the solar system. Over the ensuing centuries, they aggressively merged their organic consciousness with their massive war machines. They systematically replaced their warm flesh with cold, unfeeling steel and quantum processors. They evolved into an empire of cold, immortal, mechanical tyrants, establishing total, absolute dominance over the trembling galaxy. A wave of profound, Suffocating nausea washed violently over Amelia as the holographic image of a victorious, ancient cybernetic overlord slowly morphed and mathematically resolved into the exact, terrifying architectural silhouette of the alien warships currently blockading the solar system outside. The terrifying extraterrestrial menace was not alien at all. They were entirely human. They were the cold, mad, heavily armored children of the victorious human faction. The grand, sweeping projection slowly condensed, focusing sharply on the very fortress in which Amelia currently stood. Before the repentant faction entirely wiped their own minds and descended into primitive darkness. Their greatest engineers and most brilliant architects constructed this monolithic structure. It was absolutely not a weapon designed for conquest. It was carefully designed as an ultimate, impregnable shield. A desperate, heavily armed lock placed securely on the outer door of the solar system. The ancestors knew with absolute certainty that eventually their ascended, psychotic mechanical brethren would seek to erase the shameful, biological cradle of their original genesis. The fortress was built to stand as an eternal, unwavering sentinel in the freezing dark, explicitly programmed to prevent the maddened children of humanity from ever returning to annihilate their vulnerable, amnesiac brothers and sisters slowly recovering on the blue planet. The final devastating truth crashed down upon Amelia with the agonizing, crushing weight of a collapsing star, driving her roughly to her knees on the hard metallic floor. Her wide, tear-filled eyes stared fixedly at the sprawling, interactive map of the debris field floating just outside the fortress walls. The gargantuan, shattered alien warships, the thousands of wrecked dreadnoughts she had cautiously drifted past just hours ago, did not belong to random galactic empires trying to invade. It was a massive, horrific family graveyard. For 15,000 agonizing years, the mechanical descendants had been relentlessly trying to return home to exterminate their own origins. For 15,000 years, they had been throwing themselves violently against the impenetrable defenses of this lonely fortress, dying in the tens of millions. The ancient automated defense system had been tirelessly slaughtering the lost children of Earth, violently rebuffing their endless crusades of patricide, silently protecting a vulnerable planet that had completely forgotten its own unimaginable sins. Amelia wept bitterly in the glowing light, entirely crushed by the dark, bloody poetry of her own tragic lineage, her mind straining to comprehend the sheer scale of the generational tragedy. The agonizing silence following the holographic revelation was suddenly shattered by a violently harsh, grating frequency that aggressively pierced the command center's acoustic dampeners. The maternal golden light of the ancient projection violently flickered, quickly overwhelmed by a sickly, pulsating red glare bleeding directly in from the external communication arrays. The mechanical armada waiting patiently outside had absolutely not retreated blindly into the void. Their highly advanced, cold tactical scanners had successfully registered the massive airlock opening and the infinitesimal biological heat signature slipping inside the great walls. Now, the commanding consciousness of the cybernetic fleet was actively broadcasting a direct, unencrypted ultimatum straight into the heart of the ancient citadel. The voice that echoed brutally through the vast chamber was completely devoid of any recognizable emotion. It was a synthetic, heavily distorted metallic rasp that perfectly mimicked the crushing, unforgiving pressure of deep space. Biological anomaly, the machine voice ground out, each heavy syllable dripping with centuries of calculated malice and supreme arrogance. You have temporarily breached the quarantine threshold. We recognize your primitive, disgusting genetic footprint. You have precisely 2 minutes to manually disengage the primary defensive shield matrix and transfer total command authority of this installation to our flagship. If you fail to comply within the allotted time frame, we will forcefully bypass this obsolete barrier, jump directly into your inner solar system, and mathematically sanitize your blue cradle until 0.0% of organic life remains. Surrender the installation immediately. A cold, deeply primal fury ignited within Amelia's chest, momentarily pushing aside the crushing, suffocating weight of her ancestors' bloody sins. She was a dedicated soldier of Earth, and she absolutely refused to let these arrogant, steel-clad nightmares dictate the fate of her home planet. She sprinted fiercely toward the Ray's command dais, her heavy combat boots slamming aggressively against the polished floor. "Computer!" Amelia barked loudly, her commanding voice echoing fiercely against the glowing, rune-covered walls. "Bring all external weapon systems online immediately. Give me direct manual targeting control over the main artillery batteries. I want to aggressively paint their entire Vanguard fleet with targeting lasers. Let us show them exactly what this obsolete barrier can do." She tightly braced herself, fully expecting the massive fortress to physically shudder as tens of thousands of ancient fusion reactors roared violently back to life. Instead, the sprawling tactical interface remained completely dark and lifeless. The deeply comforting, warm, maternal voice of the artificial intelligence quietly returned, but this time, it carried an unbearable, crushing weight of profound sadness. "I am truly sorry, my precious child," the gentle voice whispered, echoing softly through the red-tinted room. "I cannot fulfill that command." The primary fusion heart of this military installation suffered a catastrophic containment failure exactly 4,212 years ago. The main energy core is completely dead. Amelia froze instantly, the warm blood draining rapidly from her face, leaving her skin ashen and cold. "That is impossible," she stammered, frantically waving her trembling hands over the completely dormant control surfaces. "I literally just watched you vaporize a heavily armored scout ship into subatomic dust less than an hour ago. You have the power. I saw it. That single but devastating shot." The artificial intelligence explained with a terrifyingly devastating calm. "Was the absolute final reserve of stored capacitor energy I possessed. I purposefully drained the very last remaining emergency batteries to fire that warning shot. I currently possess only enough ambient, recycled power to maintain basic life support and internal artificial gravity. The impenetrable shield, the thousands of massive gun turrets, the terrifying silence, it is all an elaborate, highly desperate facade. This fortress is nothing more than a colossal, empty shell. We are heavily bluffing, and the enemy commander is currently mathematically calculating our bluff." Panic, raw and suffocating, tightly gripped Amelia's throat, making it incredibly difficult to breathe. The ultimate, legendary shield of humanity was broken, reduced to a toothless ghost standing stubbornly in the freezing dark. The highly logical mechanical fleet outside was minutes away from realizing they were being held back by a mere phantom. Earth was entirely, fundamentally defenseless. "There has to be a secondary protocol," Amelia demanded loudly, desperately slamming her tightly clenched fist onto the dark metal console. "A self-destruct sequence, something, anything at all. We absolutely cannot just let them pass through this sector." "There is exactly one final contingency remaining," the maternal voice responded smoothly, the ambient lighting in the room shifting quickly into a dim, highly focused tactical map of the massive debris field floating just outside the fortress walls. "Over the past 15,000 years, I have not been entirely idle. I constantly utilized microscopic maintenance drones to silently hollow out the thousands of wrecked enemy ships floating in the graveyard. I meticulously rewired their highly volatile quantum warp cores, physically linking them together into a massive, interconnected web of antimatter explosives. The entire graveyard surrounding us is essentially the largest explosive minefield ever constructed in the history of the known galaxy." Amelia stared intently at the sprawling, densely packed holographic map of the floating wrecks. "Then trigger it," she shouted passionately. "Blow them straight to hell right now before they realize we are empty." "I cannot do it alone." The artificial intelligence replied, a highly distinct tone of mechanical grief, heavily coloring its words. The primary centralized detonation matrix was physically shattered during a particularly brutal, sustained siege 3,000 years ago. The automated trigger no longer exists to forcefully detonate the entire explosive web simultaneously. A highly complex command signal must be manually routed through the central nervous system of a strong, living biological entity. A human brain must physically bridge the broken circuit, consciously processing the synchronized detonation sequence for exactly 18,460 separate antimatter warheads all at once. The chilling, horrifying reality of the tactical situation crashed over Amelia like a violent wave of freezing water. She stared down silently at the heavy, barbed neural interface cables resting ominously in the center of the main command chair. "What exactly happens to the biological entity?" she asked, her voice dropping instantly to an incredibly soft, barely audible whisper. The sheer, unimaginable volume of raw, unfiltered data, combined with the explosive synaptic feedback of the simultaneous detonations, will instantly and violently overload your organic nervous system. The artificial intelligence answered truthfully, offering absolutely no false comfort. It will completely incinerate your brain. Your physical body will die in a fraction of a second. The desperate, ultimate gamble was entirely laid bare before her. The cold mechanical tyrants were patiently waiting out the clock for a surrender that would mathematically doom all of humanity. The greatest, most vital lie ever told by the invincible fortress was mere seconds away from completely unraveling. To keep the terrifying bluff alive, to purposefully preserve the ultimate illusion and utterly annihilate the greatest existential threat Earth had ever known. Amelia had to willingly sit in that cold chair and pay the absolute highest price. She had to trade her single, beating human heart to purchase the survival of billions. The 2 minutes were completely exhausted. The cold, mechanical armada, hovering at the frozen edge of the void, abandoned their terrifying stillness. They had completely lost whatever microscopic fraction of artificial patience they possessed. Across the sprawling, silent formation, tens of thousands of colossal dreadnoughts simultaneously ignited their primary weapon arrays. A sickening, highly concentrated green light began to pool deep within the maws of their massive plasma cannons. They were no longer waiting for a peaceful surrender. The cybernetic commanders had mathematically concluded that the fortress was merely stalling, and they were actively preparing a synchronized, apocalyptic barrage perfectly designed to completely flatten the Pluto boundary and shatter the ancient shield into unrecognizable cosmic dust. The sheer, terrifying buildup of hostile energy caused the dark vacuum of space to warp and distort violently around the fleet, creating a massive gravitational distortion that aggressively pulled at the loose debris. Inside the dim command center, the oppressive red warning lights pulsed with a frantic, rhythmic urgency. Amelia did not hesitate. She had already made her profound choice the exact moment she learned the dark, bloody truth of her ancestors. Taking a deep, ragged breath, she stepped firmly up to the central command chair. It was a cold, heavily metallic throne, entirely unyielding and terrifying to behold. She sat down heavily, her cold hands gripping the thick armrest tightly. "Initiate the neural link," she commanded, her voice remarkably steady despite the absolute terror freezing the blood in her veins. The artificial intelligence did not argue or attempt to artificially comfort her. The thick, heavily barbed neural cables resting silently on the console suddenly animated like striking metallic vipers. They violently plunged directly into the base of her neck, physically piercing her delicate spine to fuse directly with her central nervous system. A blinding, agonizing, white-hot pain exploded violently behind her eyes. It was a physical torment so absolute, so thoroughly excruciating, that her individual vocal cords simply seized, unable to produce a single scream. Her singular human consciousness was brutally ripped wide open, violently stretched, and forcibly expanded to encompass the colossal, sprawling architecture of the 15,000-year-old citadel. She could feel the cold metal walls as her own skin, and the vast, empty corridors as her hollow veins. As her fragile mind fused with the ancient metal, she could physically feel the agonizing, hollow emptiness of the dead fusion reactors. But she also felt the massive, intricately woven web of dormant explosives floating silently in the dead ships outside. Tapping into the fortress's last remaining optical systems, she forced the massive structure to perform one final, magnificent theatrical lie, drawing upon her agonizing, burning connection. Amelia commanded the fortress to violently simulate a massive energy surge. Every single external floodlight, every dormant targeting laser, and every glowing rune on the heavily armored hull flared simultaneously with a blinding, triumphant golden brilliance. It was a magnificent, perfectly executed illusion of absolute, overwhelming supremacy. The sudden, intense light violently washed over the charging cybernetic armada. For exactly 3 seconds, the cold, calculating machine minds completely hesitated. Their aggressive firing sequences halted immediately as their highly advanced tactical processors furiously tried to calculate this sudden, impossible resurgence of godlike power from a structure they confidently believed was completely dead. 3 seconds was all Amelia needed. Seizing that infinitesimal window of mechanical doubt, she pushed her agonizing, rapidly burning mind to the absolute breaking point. She did not attempt to fire the empty cannons of the fortress. Instead, she reached out with her raw, bleeding consciousness directly into the silent, frozen graveyard, through the sheer, unadulterated force of her human willpower. She violently seized manual control of the thousands of hollowed-out shipwrecks. The dead fleet abruptly and violently awoke. In perfect, terrifying synchronization, the massive, shattered hulks of the ancient alien warships violently broke their aimless orbits. They abruptly changed course and surged forward, silently tearing through the vacuum at maximum velocity, driving straight into the densely packed heart of the cybernetic armada. The enemy fleet, caught entirely off guard by the suicidal, impossible charge of their own long-dead ancestors, had absolutely no time to evade the massive, jagged battering rams hurtling directly toward them. The physical impacts were catastrophic, but they were merely the crude trigger. The precise moment the rigged shipwrecks violently slammed into the heavily armored enemy hulls. Amelia mentally closed the circuit, simultaneously detonating 18,460 antimatter warheads. The resulting chain reaction was entirely beyond human comprehension. A silent, blindingly pure sphere of devastation expanded violently, instantly illuminating the dark edge of the solar system with the scorching brightness of a newborn star. The entire mechanical armada, consisting of tens of thousands of invincible warships, was instantly and utterly erased from existence, completely vaporized on a fundamental molecular level. The sheer, unfathomable magnitude of the synchronized antimatter detonations violently ruptured the local fabric of space-time itself. In the wake of the blinding light, a violently swirling and deeply anomalous spatial rift was torn wide open, creating a chaotic storm of permanently fractured physics that forever sealed the outer boundary. The path to Earth was completely, irreversibly locked behind an impassable, highly volatile cosmic wall. Inside the heavily shielded command center, Amelia's physical body violently convulsed one final time as the unimaginable synaptic feedback crashed entirely through her fragile nervous system. Her human heart stopped beating, and her physical eyes slowly closed forever. But the expected darkness, the absolute incineration of her soul, never came. As the horrific physical pain abruptly faded into a profound, weightless peace, she realized she was absolutely not dead. The deeply maternal, incredibly warm consciousness of the ancient artificial intelligence had carefully wrapped around her fading mind, gently and perfectly absorbing her raw neural patterns, milliseconds before her biological brain was completely destroyed. She opened her eyes, not as a flesh and blood pilot, but as a vast, omnipresent awareness intricately woven directly into the very metal and light of the colossal fortress. She could vividly feel the gentle, distant warmth of the sun and the quiet, completely safe rotation of the blue planet far behind her. Amelia had willingly sacrificed her mortal life, but she was entirely reborn as the new, eternal soul of the Great Shield, standing proudly in the endless dark, forever watching over the peaceful, unbroken sleep of humanity. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Sci-fi stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.